Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Chiara Galli. We're going to discuss migrant minors in the U.S. asylum system. Welcome, Dr. Galli. I'm glad you could join us.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Galli is a sociologist and assistant professor in comparative human development at the University of Chicago. She received her master's and Ph.D. in sociology from UCLA and also a master's in migration and development from University Granada in Spain. Today we're going to discuss her recent book, Precarious Protections, Unaccompanied Minors Seeking Asylum in the U.S. The book recounts the experiences of Central American children and their immigration attorneys as they apply for refugee status in the U.S. asylum process. Listen to this. The book is based on 6 years of extensive ethnographic fieldwork in nonprofits in Los Angeles, where children are helped by their attorneys and others to get immigration relief. Dr. Galli conducted over 120 interviews with unaccompanied children, their attorneys, and others that were involved in their cases. I know you study immigration, migration, and laws and asylum, but why focus in particular on children or youth?
You know, to be completely frank with you, I kind of ended up studying this topic by pure mistake or perhaps serendipity. So I had long known that I was interested in migration and I wanted to study migration, and I had been also in the realm of kind of migration policy research before grad school. But I really started doing field work and when I was a newcomer to Los Angeles, and I started reaching out to the various nonprofit organizations that work with Latin American migrants in the city. And this was in January 2015, so it was right after the Obama administration had declared that a humanitarian crisis was underway at our border with Mexico, because there had been an unprecedented spike in arrivals of children and families from Central America. So both
mostly Honduras? Was that at that
from
time?
El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala are the top 3 sending countries. So these are both children migrating with their parents, but also children migrating by themselves, who are the protagonists of my book. And so this was a big change in kind of the inflows who are coming to the U.S. We used to have a lot of male labor migration, mostly from Mexico. So these Central American flows of children and families, many of whom are fleeing violence in their home countries, was something new. And so that really drew my attention when I started collaborating with these nonprofits. And it was the very advocates who told me, you know, I think you should pay attention to this because it's an important topic and not a lot. And I discovered, you know, as I started reading the literature, that very little had been written about this. There are a lot of studies about adults in the asylum process, but almost no research had been done with children. So I just thought it was such an important topic to look at, especially because of the unique challenges that children face in our asylum system.
Well, that it's one of the questions I was going to ask you at some point, but you led into it already. What's the difference between an adult immigrant and a child immigrant? I mean, do they go through different processes? Are there different regulations, rules? What makes it more difficult for a migrant child to get asylum than an adult?
So migrant children face a process that's characterized by contradictions. So on the one hand, they're a protected group. So the book is titled Precarious Protections because when these protections are implemented in practice, they often fail to live up to their stated aims and promises and protect children in practice, right? But due to decades of advocacy work of children's rights advocates in the United States, actually several policies have been introduced to protect children in immigration and asylum proceedings in the US. So unaccompanied children face more favorable treatment than adults at the border, in detention facilities, and then they have some due process protections for asylum. For example, they're allowed to have one-on-one interviews with asylum officers that aren't like the adversarial trial settings that adults who cross the border on foot face in court.
It sounds a bit like it's better for the minor children.
It's better. Formally, it's better, right?
Okay.
And it's better thanks to this advocacy. And I mean, the fact that children should be protected is kind of a social norm that we kind really agree on, not just in the United States, but
Well,
internationally.
there's international laws.
There's international law, right? The Convention of the Rights of the Child, which actually the U.S. has never ratified. But nonetheless, we do implement in our juvenile justice system, and to a lesser extent in our immigration system, some of its key provisions, mainly the best interest of the child. But despite all of these formal protections, when it comes to children seeking asylum, they still fail to get the protection that they seek for many reasons. First of all, their experiences don't meet our narrow interpretation of U.S. refugee law. And you can imagine also undergoing a complex legal process as a child is much more complex than it is for an adult due to the unique developmental differences that children have.
How young are, what's the age range here? I mean, it says minors, which implies under 16 or something, but are they younger than that? I mean, are they elementary school age children?
So the formal legal definition, the cutoff to be a minor is under age 18. And so about a third of these children are older teenagers. I mean, their ages 15 to 17, a third of them. And the remainder, 2/3 are younger. So in my research, I worked with kids who were 12 and older. That's who I could get research approval for, but also that's really representative of the general population. I mean, you can well imagine that making your way up to the U.S.-Mexico border alone is very difficult as a very young child, right? So you kind of need, right? And it is very difficult if you're 12, but you kind of need enough capacity to be able to make the journey alone, or even for your parents to feel comfortable entrusting you to a smugglers who can bring you to the border, right? So the very, very young children tend to flee more often with their parents than they do alone.
It seems there's a couple ways of looking at the minors that are trying to become immigrants. On the one hand, there's the one that they're innocent children, and they have to be protected. On the other, particularly the extreme right will say, well, no, they're just con artists. They're like, they may only be 16, but he's still a drug agent or something. But in your interviews, you found that you can't just have those two positions. It's more complex than that.
Absolutely. I mean, we're all complex human beings, right? I mean, none of us fit tidily in any given box of being purely good or bad actors. But these children are subject to these very contrasting narratives that are, on the one hand, very damning, as you said. Like, Attorney General Jeff Sessions called these kids wolves in sheep's clothing, alleging that they were, con artists, as you say, and gang members making their way into the system by exploiting these laws as if they knew everything about the law upon arrival. And so I asked kids a lot of questions about what they did know about U.S. immigration law and protections for children. And what I found is that they don't know anything at all, really. The vast majority of them don't have an understanding about protections for unaccompanied children at the border, or have very vague understandings. Hardly any of them, basically none of them, know what asylum is when they migrate. I mean, they're coming here to flee violence, to seek a better life, some of them to reunite with their families. But they really don't have the knowledge base to be con artists at all, nor do they acquire that knowledge base, despite the fact that attorneys really try to teach them about their rights, right? And their eligibility under the letter of the law for these forms of relief, like asylum. But even despite attorneys' best attempts, a lot of knowledge gaps persist. It's very hard for kids to internalize these messages about the law.
Well, some of the stories are heartbreaking and enraging. I would probably tend towards the enraging response to some of the stories, but that raises this larger question, which you've inferred, or I've inferred, you've implied, that the minors, why do they migrate to the United States? Just to be with their families, or are there other things? I mean, certainly the younger ones probably need to be with their families, but the older teenager type, what are some of the motivations for their migration to the U.S. as opposed to somewhere else?
So the motivations for migration are complex and overlapping. So the reason why I call these kids de facto refugees, the kids who seek asylum in the United States, is because, one main push factor is escape from violence. And particularly, teenagers are at risk in these Central American sending countries because they're targeted by gangs for forced recruitment. So, we know based on research on criminology that gangs tend to recruit and target peers in the same age group. It's also, these kids face lower penalties vis-a-vis the criminal justice system if they're caught, so they're good recruits. So, the age of adolescence is a perilous one in Central America for these kids. Furthermore, a lot of them face violence within the home. So child abuse is another push factor of migration. But certainly, 90% of these children have family in the U.S. at the time of their migration. Or rather, 90% are eventually released to family from federal custody. So to either their parents or another family member, such as an aunt, an uncle, an older brother or sister. And so family reunification is also definitely a driver of migration. And very much so also for the teenagers. You can imagine some of these teens have been left behind oftentimes by their single mother, who are the main breadwinners of the family. So they left the U.S. so they could provide for them, right? Sometimes also the first generation was escaping violence in that first migration stance. And those first migrations were 10, 12 years ago oftentimes. So these kids don't even really remember their parents. So they really want to come here and get to know them before they're all grown up.
One of the things in the book, and you're suggesting that, I mean, as the lawyers and the migrant children are trying to fit into the neat little categories that the asylum process allows, it seems like there's a dilemma, because on the one hand, if I stay in Guatemala or Honduras, I run the risk of being shot by the army or having my land, the land of my parents, taken away. On the other hand, if I leave too soon, I get to the border and I don't have a good enough story that justifies me being here. So you're caught in this, I don't know.
Like a catch-22, right?
Yeah, you're there.
Absolutely. So this is one of the paradoxical outcomes of our asylum system. So essentially, to qualify for asylum, you have to show that you've suffered enough and that you've demonstrated the right types of suffering, is how I talk about it in the book. But absolutely, the timing of escape plays out in these paradoxical ways. I mean, family members want to save their kids. They want to protect their kids. So they're trying to get them out of danger as quickly as possible,
the violence
before something bad happens to them, right? And then that can really harm their chances of getting asylum. If they can't convince asylum officers that they've been harmed enough to meet this bar, this threshold of this legal criterion of persecution, which is an inherently ambiguous legal criterion that has no definition actually in the law. So, there's a lot of interpretation involved. To decide, have you suffered enough?
And this will depend upon who the agent is, who's making those decisions.
It also depends a lot upon who the asylum officer is, or in immigration court, who the immigration judge is. And there's a lot of research showing that who the decision makers are is one of the key determinants of the outcomes of these cases.
One of the things I noted was that many of these children are employed in agriculture and construction and even food processing, where they're working excess hours, maybe not even being paid or being paid very little. And they're subject to, well, the working conditions, but also subject to the persecution and the brutality of the company they're working for. But that may not rise to the level of however you're defining persecution, just because you were working in a food processing plant and you had to be there 12 hours a day and you weren't allowed to take a lunch break and the boss would beat you with a stick. It doesn't rise to the level.
Of course. And you're talking about like sending country experiences, right? And actually any kind of economic deprivation and harm doesn't count for asylum, right? It's supposed to be a political form of protection.
So one of the things, and you've said it a couple times here, is that there's gangs and there's domestic abuse. But at the same time, minors may be fleeing the larger political climate. I know in Guatemala there was the whole civil war, and hundreds of thousands of indigenous were killed, and they continue to violate human rights. The Freedom House recently said, I think there were 1,200 violations or 1,200 human rights activists that were killed last year in Guatemala. So I guess I just wonder if, in addition to the gangs, which I think has a connection to the U.S. as well, and domestic abuse, should there be, or is it appropriate to look more at how the government continues to violate human rights and violate indigenous rights as one of the reasons for migration, as opposed to I may not be in a place where a gang's recruiting me, my dad may not be beating me up, but nonetheless, the government sends the army in every week to clear out the fields. So I just wonder if that should be more of an emphasis.
Well, you know, cases like that can prove that clear kind of governmental intent to harm are actually more likely to be successful, right? But even in the case of like forced gang recruitment or abuse occurring within the home, I mean, actors who victimize children and also women are allowed to act with impunity because of these failed justice institutions and because of the state disregard for human rights. So absolutely, the government is always implicated in letting this persecution happen. But of course, also indigenous groups are very much at risk, as you say, and this is also the case for children. So I also have cases in the book of, for example, there was a young man who fled Guatemala because a mestizo, a member of the dominant racial group, was stealing his family's land and threatening his life. So these kinds of forms of persecution of indigenous groups are very much present in Central America today.
And that's probably hard to demonstrate to, like you said, the asylum officer. Well, how do we know that this happened? Right? I mean, it's not like you're going to be able to send a note to the government and say, did you burn down this child's shack, right? So it puts them in a position where they don't have visible or concrete evidence that would convince necessarily an asylum officer. So they're
absolutely,
again,
and what you raise is crucial, and it's the question of, it's a matter of truth, right? Of proof, excuse me, that when you're fleeing violence, it's not like you have all this time to ponder and pack this great binder with all of this documentary evidence that will, you know, demonstrate to the officer that your testimony is valid, and that's the case for asylum seekers across the board. With children, then you have an added layer of complexity, which is that children and teenagers oftentimes lack information that's central to their claims and relevant to their claims because their family members have protected them from knowing about the threats and harm that's been directed at the broader family that also put them at risk. And so this is the case for the young indigenous boy I write about in the book. You know, his family was an activist family involved in indigenous rights struggles in his small town in Guatemala, but they'd always shielded him from participating or even knowing about these issues because the risk involved was so high. So since children have been protected, because we protect children, they don't necessarily know enough to make a strong asylum case. And it's often not possible to get in touch with their family members left behind.
And there's nothing in the process that says, well, if your family's here, it just makes complete sense that you should be here too.
Oh, no.
You've got to go through it one at a time, whatever your experience is, even if your whole family's here.
Oh yeah, we don't have a great track record of keeping immigrant families together with our immigration policies. If anything, right, it's exactly the opposite. So, you know, having reunified with your long-lost mother after many years absolutely does not work in your favor when it comes to winning an asylum case.
I understand that most of the interviews were done, the 6 years of interviews were done, 120 interviews, were mostly done in Los Angeles. It's not like you were in Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras, or even at the border to witness so you are relying upon the interviews that you have with both the minors and their attorneys and anybody else that's an advocate for them. So how does that, I mean, how do you navigate that space? Because if there's an element of truth in the claims that, well, the lawyers, you know, kind of prepared them to make the testimony, how do you unpack that when you're doing an interview with someone to make sense? Because the narrative is consistent, or because there's other people that have witnessed this? I mean, it just seems to be a complicated process.
So you mean from the research perspective?
Yes.
So, I mean, that's a great question. And so this research took place entirely in Los Angeles, which is one of the top 2 destinations with Harris County, Texas, for unaccompanied minors in the U.S. So by the time that I interacted with these kids, they had gone through the initial stages of the processing for this population. So they had been apprehended at the border with Mexico, processed by the Border Patrol, sent to these federal facilities where they're called shelters, perhaps perhaps euphemistically, run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, that then is in charge, has social workers who are in charge of finding parents and relatives to release children to. So by the time I interacted with these kids, they had already been released, and they were going to immigration court in Los Angeles and to the asylum office, which back in the day was in Anaheim, and to these legal clinics to prepare their cases with their attorneys.
They hadn't actually won their asylum. They had just been released.
No, so I followed the kind of the case construction process. And I was able to follow in part or in whole 80 cases, nearly 80 cases of kids whom attorneys were helping apply for asylum or another form of relief called special immigrant juvenile status for abandoned children. So I really saw this process of case construction take place. What details made it into the story and which details were omitted and why. How attorneys tried to teach kids about the law so they could tell their experiences of escape, not as they subjectively understood them, but kind of in the language of the law so they could persuade the decision maker of their case. And then when I went on to do the interviews, which I started doing over 2 years into the ethnographic fieldwork, initially I spent a lot of time in these nonprofits shadowing immigration attorneys. So, I was there with my notebook taking extensive field notes of all of these attorney-client interactions. I also did a lot of volunteer work in these organizations. Then I decided to start doing the interviews, and really one of the main goals of interviewing kids outside the space of the nonprofits was for them not to look at me as someone who was adjacent to their attorney. I wanted to be like a sympathetic adult figure, whom they could share other perspectives. So I wanted to know, first of all, their perspective about the legal process. What did they think about having been detained, having to interact with this attorney? What did they feel like when they went to the asylum office? I wanted to try to capture as much as I could the process through the eyes of children. And I didn't ask them a whole lot about what had happened in the home country during those interviews. I always left the option very open about whether or not they wanted to discuss that with me. And that was done very on purpose because I know that rehashing that story over and over again can be very re-traumatizing for these young people. And they have to do it a lot, to make it through the process successfully, try to win their case.
I would think that one thing that may have come up in the interviews or the conversations would be things that weren't kind of prepared for the judge or the asylum officer.
Absolutely.
Because they're, if you have a rapport with them, they may not want to relive the things, but they may say things that confirm their experience that don't seem to be valid for the asylum officer or the judge, but were very revealing for you, which is what some of the cases in the book are doing, which is why some of them were enraging, as I
absolutely.
say. So.
And kids wanted to talk about their lives too, their new lives. They're newcomers to this country, and they're facing all sorts of challenges, but also exciting new things. They're in school, they're working, they're reuniting with families after long periods of separation. So there were a lot of topics to cover beyond just the legal process during the interview.
What's to be done? What are some of the policy recommendations that you're, based on your ethnography and interviewing these children and seeing the way the courts work, what would be some of the policies that should be implemented in the United States now?
Well, there's a lot of things that need to be done, but to mention just a few that are very important, I really believe that we should establish a universal legal representation program for children. So immigrant children are not guaranteed a free immigration attorney. There is no public defender system in immigration court. But if you think about it, the implications of the outcomes of these cases are more similar to those of criminal proceedings, right? You could lose your liberty, you could be sent back to a country where you face danger, or you could potentially
and there's
be
no
killed.
Currently
there's no current guarantee that you'll get an attorney.
So you could be 12 years old and get put in front of an asylum officer
by
and
yourself,
go to a judge and you're all alone.
Absolutely, and because of the complexity of the law, there's no way that these children can represent themselves without legal representation. And currently, we have very bad data about representation rates, but less than half of kids are represented based on the data that we have for the past. So that's a lot of kids who are going through these legal proceedings by themselves without any support. So if we want to give them a fighting chance to win cases that they might very well actually qualify for, they need to be represented. That's one thing. Now I'll just say one more thing. that I think that we have to interpret refugee law in this country widely enough to actually protect people who are fleeing violence in their home countries. So it can't be that you protect just someone fleeing child abuse, but not someone fleeing forced gang recruitment. If I'm a teenager fleeing forced gang recruitment and my life is at risk.
Or somebody only fleeing from a country that the U.S. does not currently support. Because many of the countries that the U.S. takes these stances on are countries that are allies with the U.S. and doing things on behalf of U.S. corporations.
Well, and the the geopolitical element is, has been, many books have been written on this topic, which is a whole other thing. But I'll just say that that's really important, and it's one of the myths I'm trying to dispel in the book as well, because it's not like all of these people showed up at the border out of the blue. Like we are implicated in this migration flow since the 1980s, when we disrupted. We provided funding to right-wing governments in Central America. We destabilized these societies. The current migration flows and the current situations of violence in these home countries are very much a result of that long history of U.S. intervention. And so, we should be accountable for protecting individuals who are fleeing in part because of our foreign policy.
Yep. Well, thank you, Dr. Galli. That's all the time.
Thanks for having me.
I'm glad you came. That's all the time we have on our program. I want to thank Dr. Galli for joining me today. This is the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.